Okay, we got Megan Evans here today. I'd like to introduce her. Hey, Megan, glad you could make it.
Hi, thanks.
Yeah, okay. So, Megan's with the Alberta Native Bee Council. Megan holds a degree in environmental science and a master's degree in ecology from the U of C. She became interested in bees when she worked as a summer student on a pollinator research study with Agriculture Canada. Megan joined the Alberta Invasive Species Council as the executive director in 2020. After spending 5 years with the provincial government, Megan spent time as a board director for the Alberta Invasive Species Council, the Entomological Society of Alberta. Hopefully I did that right. I got a thumbs up from Megan. Um, and she is the founding president of the Alberta Native Bee Council in 2017. A little bit about the Alberta Native Bee Council. It's a volunteer-run, registered nonprofit organization established in Alberta in 2017. The council's vision is to have a healthy and resilient native pollinator populations in Alberta, and they aim to realize this through research and monitoring, advocacy, education, and collaboration with others. Okay, Megan, we're very excited to have you here. I guess I'll give you the floor.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. You guys have an amazing turnout. What are we, 49 people? That's fantastic. So I know I'm actually in the Crow's Nest Pass, and it is like 18 degrees and sunny out right now. So huge kudos to everyone for joining us here. So okay, so 7:52. I've got lots to cover, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here. So thanks again for the invitation. So in my talk, I'm going to talk to you about first, the biodiversity of insects in general, because insects are really, really important to us as humans, and we kind of ignore and neglect them, especially when it comes to conservation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that kind of as my public service announcement. Then we will talk about the diversity of wild bees. Guys, this is the exciting stuff. And I hope that everybody here gets to learn something tonight. I can tell you that my journey learning about bees started, as Jolene said, working with Ag Canada back in the day, but it's still ongoing. I still learn all kinds of things all the time. Then we're going to talk about wild bee life cycles. So most of our wild bees are actually solitary and they live in the ground. So that kind of turns on its head what we think of when we think about bees, right? So we'll talk about that, and that's always very exciting. And then we'll finish off by talking about the difference between our managed bees and our wild bees. And that's a really important distinction. And hopefully everyone can kind of come away from this talk with that information. Okay, so this is a pie chart of global animal biodiversity. And as you can clearly see, the insects make up have the most species out of all these different organisms. So each of these pieces of the pie are, created based on the amount or the number of species within each group of animals. And by far, yeah, we have way more insect species than we have any other animal species on the planet. And when we talk about biodiversity, this pie chart, this is what we mean. But when we talk about the conservation of biodiversity, the situation is very, very different. And we focus in on just a few of these slices of the pie. And even within those charismatic megafauna slices, there are still biases towards certain species, especially with regard to conservation efforts. And this is really problematic because insects are really, really important to us as humans, as I mentioned. And of course, everyone here tonight knows that bees are important because they're pollinators. And there's lots of other organisms and animals and insects that are pollinators as well. Insects are also important to us in the nutrient cycling services that they provide. So insects as well as microbes and all kinds of things are playing a role in that. But without things like dung beetles, we would be sitting under miles and miles of cow poop or other decaying organic matter, right? We really need this insect mediated microbial mediated nutrient cycling. It's really critical for the world to kind of function. We also rely on insects to provide pest control of other insects. Now, sometimes people call me out on this one and say, well, that's a net zero, but regardless, they are providing pest control because there's lots of insects like wasps that eat other insects, right? And along those same lines, insects are a really, really important food source for other animals. And, even though individual insects themselves are quite small, it is just the sheer number of them that contributes a tremendous amount of biomass into our food webs and our trophic systems. And that's a really important food source for lots of other animals. So researchers, this is a dated study now, this was 2006. So researchers in the States tried to put a price tag, like a value on what these ecosystem services are worth to us. And they decided that, or estimated that ecosystem services in the US that are provided by insects are worth $57 billion every single year. And that's, just in the US, and those are in 2006 dollars. So those numbers would actually be quite a bit higher today. So insects are really, really critical, really important to us. However, they're declining, and they are declining drastically. So for a long, long time, researchers were saying, seeing anecdotal evidence that these insects were declining. So for example, something I've seen in my lifetime is that, when I'm driving on the highway, I don't have to stop and squeegee my windshield anymore. I worked at a gas station when I was in high school in the 90s, and I had to squeegee windshields, and I can tell you, you had to, put a bit of effort into it, and you don't really have to do that anymore, do you? So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and now more recently, we've seen strong empirical evidence that is showing these trends as well. So I've got a couple of papers that show examples here. So the first is a German researcher who published in 2017, and this my dog is crying at the door. Just one moment. Sorry, guys. There, everything's better with the world. He's inside. Okay, sorry. So this German researcher in protected areas. So he found a 75% decline of insect biomass over 27 years. So 75% decline. That's a huge number. This is a really, really big deal. And then even more recently in 2019, a couple of researchers, they reviewed all of the other papers and studies that have been done. And they extrapolated utilizing those data, and they extrapolated, and they figured that 40% of our insect species are at risk of extinction over the next few decades. 40% of our insect species. If we were talking about mammals here, people would be losing their minds, but we don't seem to have that same level of concern when we talk about insects, which is crazy because we just talked about how important they were. We only just went through a few examples of the importance of them. They're absolutely critical to us and to the world as we know it. So what I ask from all of you is to talk to your friends, talk to your siblings and your children and your neighbors, and tell them that insects matter, and start having a look at them. And the more we talk about this issue, the more it becomes an issue, and the more resources will actually become allocated for conservation research focused on insects. So I'm sorry, now my cat is here. She's right here. So the whole family's in the room tonight. So public service announcement for insects. We're going to move right along though, and we're going to focus in on bees as promised. So what I have for you next is a quiz. So this isn't a poll, but this is a quiz. So what I want you to do, maybe we can use the chat feature, and maybe Jelaine, you can read out the answers as they come in. What I'd like folks to do is to tell me which are not bees. So we've got lots of insects on the screen. These are all insects that you can find in Alberta. And I want you guys to tell us which are not bees. So have a look. They're all numbered. Feel free to pop it into the chat. Do we have any answers coming in? Are there any answers? There's no answers.
Not yet.
No answers. Okay,
They're thinking. Oh, we have Kirsten says number one.
Number one. Okay, this thing's pretty crazy looking, right? This is how they got the inspiration for some Christmas ornaments, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, a couple more answers. Another number one. Two people said all bees. 4 people said all bees so far. Mm-hmm. Another gal, 4, 7, and 8. Not 5. 5. All bees. 5. All bees.
Okay. So we're across the board. Okay. So we can shut that down. So first of all, I'm impressed. Many of you got the right answer, which is that these are all bees. And these are all bees that you can find literally right here in Alberta. You could literally find any of these species in your backyard. How amazing is that? And the other thing I'll say is that I've been doing these talks for over 10 years, and the level of the general public's knowledge of bees has increased exponentially. So I'm so pleased to for so many of you to recognize these were all bees, that shows that we've come a long way. And for everyone else, we're going to talk about these different types of bees tonight, the types of habitats that they need, their life cycles, so that you can kind of really understand where to find them, where they are, and what you can do to help them. So we're just going to move right along. That's great, you guys, really great. So in Alberta, we know because of the federal government's general status of wild species. So every 5 years, the federal government comes up with this report. They list all of our wild species, and then they also assign a conservation status ranking for each of those species. So this is where all of these numbers that I'm going to present are going to come from. And quite frankly, if you're interested in learning more about wildlife, animals, or insects, this is a really cool report, and you can download it right off the internet. So if you Google the general status of species in Canada, you can find that information. So in Alberta, we have 321 native bee species on record, and only 28 of them are bumblebees. So less than 10% of our native bees are bumblebees, which is pretty incredible because bumblebees are kind of, probably the bees we're most familiar with. So, almost 300 other species that kind of look more like those crazy ones that we saw on the last slide. And then we have 5 non-native species on record. And a strong example of that, probably the bee that we're most familiar with of the non-native species would be the European honeybee. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about managed bees coming up in a minute. Okay, so how are our bees doing? So again, this information is from the general status of species in Canada. So of those 321 native bee species, about just over 50% of them are either secure or apparently secure. About a quarter are unrankable, and they're unrankable because we don't have enough data. We don't know enough about them to assign this conservation status ranking. And just a little less than a quarter are either vulnerable, imperiled, or critically imperiled. So when you take a step back and you look at this, it's telling us that about 50% of our bees are okay, and 50% are either so data deficient we don't know, or they're declining. So that's not a great picture, right? Like we could probably improve that quite a bit. So that's kind of the status of our bees. And so why are some of these bees declining? So there are a number of major threats. So one would be habitat loss. So native grasslands are one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. So, the work like we just heard about is so critically important, not only that we are harvesting native seed and planting native seed, restoring native grasslands, but also conserving our native grasslands. Now, that's not to say that bees only live in grasslands. They live in forested ecosystems as well, but forested ecosystems regenerate and kind of evolve over time. But native grasslands, certainly in Alberta, certainly with regard to our fescue grasslands, are really hard to put back. So we need to be conserving these native habitats, whether they be grasslands or forests or whatever they are, as much as we can. So habitat loss is a major factor for native bee decline. Pesticide poisoning is, of course, an issue. Not all pesticides are created equal with regards to the risk that they pose to our native bees, but some are certainly believed to be worse than others. For example, neonicotinoids, right? And those are typically coming in a seed coat. So, we cover all of the seed with this chemical and then put it on the ground. And then it's a systemic pesticide that's brought into the plant, the plant itself, and it's present in the pollen and nectar. So it can be really problematic. Yeah, so not all pesticides are as bad as others, but quite frankly, most of the research that's been done on pesticide issues for bees has been done on managed bees and not on wild bees. Although, we're probably going to see similar impacts, we simply just don't know is the thing. So we need to be careful there. Pathogens. Pathogens are a major factor with regard to native bee decline. So of course, there are all kinds of native pathogens and things that they evolved with, like bacteria and fungi and parasitoids and diseases, you name it. They have all those things that they deal with just like us, right? But we're very concerned about the introduction of novel pathogens. So let's, compare that to the novel coronavirus, right, that we've been dealing with for the last year. So, that's a virus that the humans have no immunity toward, and that's why it's so problematic for us. It's the same thing with bees. So we'll talk more about this later, but we have to be very careful when we're moving bees around, and making sure that we're not bringing in new diseases that might spread to our wild bees, because it can be absolutely devastating. And then finally, climate change is another issue as well. And I think, this one's probably a little less understood. We don't fully understand exactly how climate change is going to impact native bees, and it might differ in areas, right? But some of the things we do anticipate are, and have possibly already seen, are expansions and reductions in ranges for native bee species, and also the messing up of synchronicity. Oh my goodness, I'm not going to get that right. The flowers are not going to bloom at the same time as the bees are going to emerge. So we're going to see like that kind of potentially not match up very well. Not articulate. You guys know what I mean. So yes, definitely some consequences there with regard to climate change as well. So there's a lot of things that are impacting our native bees. So let's talk about bumblebees. So bumblebees, this is probably, what comes to mind for to you when you think about bees. The bumblebees are big and they're loud, they're fuzzy, they're obvious, right? We see them, we hear them, we notice them. But as we mentioned, only 10% of our native bees look like this. So we'll talk more about the other ones in a sec. But bumblebees really do fit the bill of what we think of when we think about bees, because they're a social insect. That means that they have a queen bee, they have a worker bee, and they have male bees. So the queen and the worker are both females. The only difference is that the queen is fed more food and better quality food while she's developing. So that allows her to grow larger in size, which is very clear to see here. These are bees of all the same species. So the queen is larger in size and she has fully developed reproductive bits, which is important because her job is to lay eggs and grow her colony, right? Grow her little family. Worker bees, as the name suggests, do all the work. So they collect the pollen and nectar, they do nest hygiene, they feed developing bees, they'll fan the outside of the nest on a hot summer day, which is really cool to see. So they're doing all the work, just as their name suggests. And then finally, we have male bees. And I'm sure we all know in the bee world that male bees have a very important but singular role. So they emerge to mate with the queens and then they die. So that is the role of the male bees. It's short and sweet. Okay, so this is your typical life cycle. So right now it's spring in Alberta. It's the most wonderful time of the year, you guys. It's springtime. So that means that our queen bumblebees are emerging from their hibernation. So I'll back up a sec. So only in the winter, the only bumblebees we have present in Alberta are queen bees that are hibernating. So they emerge in the spring, and those early spring flowers, like we just heard about, are really, really important for those early emerging queen bees, because they need to build up their energy reserve so that they can go start a nest. So in the wild, native bees will nest in old rodent holes in tussocks of grass. So we were talking about how grasses are important for bees too. So those bunch grasses can provide nesting habitat for bumblebees in some cases. They'll nest, I always have bumblebees nesting in my woodpile in the back every year. They'll anywhere where they can like get into like an opening or a cavity where they're protected from rain and from predators and stuff, they're pretty content. So any type of little opening like that, they're happy with. So the bumblebee queen will produce a little vessel that she makes out of a waxy-like substance, which is called a honey pot. And this is where she's going to store her honey, her bumblebee honey that she will use to feed her developing bumblebee larvae. How cool is that? So bumblebees do make honey. They just don't make it in massive amounts like honeybees. And that's why we don't harvest bumblebee honey. So all of our native bees have an annual life cycle. That's how they evolved to deal with our brutal winters here, right? When it's super cold and there's no food. So they have this annual life cycle where the queens overwinter in the ground, and they don't need food throughout the winter. So that's why we don't harvest bumblebee honey, because they simply don't make tons of it. So the queen then creates a nest cell. She lays eggs in the nest cell or nest cells. Those eggs develop into larvae, and then they develop into pupae, and then they emerge as adults, typically some few weeks later. So the colony will grow in size based on the amount of food that's available and a few other factors, but food is a very strong determinant of the size of these bumblebee nests. So if there's lots of food and it's close by, these nests can grow to be quite large in size. But if they're having to fly like long distances to collect their food and using a lot of energy, that will really limit the growth of the colony. So towards the end of the summer, the queen produces eggs that will become new queens, and she produces eggs that will become males. And you might wonder, well, how in the world does she pick? Because we don't get to pick, right? Well, all of our bees, wasps, and ants are what we call haploid diploid. So that means that the males are the product of fertilized eggs. The males are the product of unfertilized eggs, and the females are the product of fertilized eggs. So the queen actually actively chooses, she stores sperm after she mates, And she actually releases sperm and fertilizes eggs as she lays them, and chooses to do so or not to do so, depending on which type of egg she needs to lay. And then for the queens, she knows that the colony knows that they need to create larger nest cells for the queens. And again, that they need to get fed better food and more food while they're developing so that they can grow to be larger in size. So this is really important. So it's really, there's a lot of interesting things happening there. I'm not sure we totally understand, how that works, but it's really important and interesting stuff. So when the new queens and the males emerge, they leave the nest, they mate. And then at that point, everybody dies off. It's very, very sad. So the queen that started the nest, she dies off. The workers that were produced that season, they die off. The males that just emerged and mated with the new queens, they die off. And it's just that newly emerged, newly mated queen that goes on to overwinter. It's typically in the ground, somewhere in the ground. So that is a bumblebee life cycle. It's